this was a good conversation. I think I got a little bit hot and bothered. I think I
I,
burned down the house.
no, I understand. I think your temperament reflects my inner temperament as well. I think your frustration is a reflection of America's frustration. I even think that there are many people that may even support Jordan are frustrated by the situation that we are in. But I want to get back to the constant insults we have to endure in the political language that has developed. And I definitely want to remind us that we are not enemies. We have different beliefs or different solutions. And many of those solutions are based on our life's perspectives.
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Welcome back, my friends, to the show that never ends. Peter and Phil, Courageous Conversation. Dr. Nelson, always a pleasure.
Wait a minute. This show is never going to end?
Never.
Gee, I didn't sign up for that, Peter. Although we can always find problems, so I guess you're right. The show that never does end. Hello, Peter. How you doing? And hello to our listeners. How things going, my man?
They're going. They're going. The world is a bit insane out there, but they're going. And I want to thank Nationwide for supporting our insanity and our conversations, which are a little bit of both. So normally I come poorly prepared, but and I think this came out of the conversation we've had recently, but I want to entitle this Get Your House in Order. And Phil, this has nothing to do with yours and Doris's house or Sharon and my house. It has everything to do with the House of Representatives and the inability for us to get our quote unquote house in order.
Well, you know what? I had a topic too, but I think my topic is going to intertwine with yours very well. It just shows the frustration that we are all feeling right now. And for the sake of the audience, in terms of a temporal location, we are recording this particular conversation right after Scalise was nominated for the Speaker of the House, then gave it up because he couldn't get elected. And then our second Republican, who Dr. Weinstein probably wants to talk about, was nominated and went through 2 votes and fell backwards on the second vote. And now they're considering giving temporary power to the temporary speaker simply so that they can do the work of the American people.
Yeah, I would suggest it's been an embarrassing month.
Not just for the Republican Party.
No, for the United States, for
Yes.
the leading democratic country in the world to show its lack of leadership.
Our Congress has suddenly become the British Parliament, and it's with the party in power in the House not being able to form a workable coalition, and honestly using the second party of the 2-party system as its foil for its own mishaps.
It's interesting to how easy it is to blame everybody else for your inability to make an action for the greater good. There just seems to, and this goes back to some of the conversations that we've had in the past, but some of this is term limits and some of it is the chasm that we've got between right, left, and center, and just an inability to recognize that, in my opinion, that the role of the House and the Senate and all of the DC is really to act in the best interests of the American people. But there's way too much self-interest that's going on in Washington at the moment.
Well, I totally agree. I think, though, that what bothers me the most is if you listen closely to the language that's being used by the Republican Party or by members, excuse me, by members of the Republican Party, you suddenly understand the deepest of the roots of our problem. And I think it begins with the demonization of the word compromise and the demonization of the opposite party, be it Democrat or Republican. And the example I want to choose is that when Representative Jordan suggested a day after after he failed the first election, first vote failed to secure him as speaker, he made the comment that, well, maybe the only other option is to cede some control to the Democratic Party and work with them, and the American people don't want that. Now, that is a quote, and it infers and implies. First of all, it assumes he speaks for the American people, which is totally absurd when he can't even assume that he speaks for the Republican Party. If he did, he'd have no problems becoming speaker. But I found it more than insulting that he would suggest that he was following the wishes of the American people. And if he was, then he has a very narrow definition of who Americans are. There's so many inferences and deductions that are questionable and irritating and frankly dangerous here. And it peppers the entire conversation for me. It goes even, they go even further to say that if you listen to the rhetoric that's going on, one of the choices is to consult with the Democratic Party and say, who among us would you find acceptable, respectful? Not who among the Republicans do you think will do your bidding, but who do you trust? Who do you trust to at least follow long-standing democratic, with a small d, principles, so that we can get the work of the American people done? The representative from, I believe, South Carolina, wore a shirt with a scarlet A to the vote, to the second vote, because of her vote on the first one, because she was pilloried and intimidated. I mean, this violent minority that we talked about in the past, that now we send our minions to send terrorizing emails to our spouses and to ask, why did your spouse vote this way? You need to get them on board. All of a sudden, we are deciding who Americans are, who Republicans are, who Democrats are, and there cannot be any dalliance, any variance, excuse me for using this word, any diversity of opinion. And that's how we can allow 8 people to hamstring 400 members of Congress.
Yeah, and I always thought democracy was the freedom to have different opinions and to share those opinions. And that respect came from being willing to agree to disagree and have these courageous conversations. Maybe we should be playing this in the halls of Congress, courageous conversations, because I think when somebody says that it's the will of the people, what does that mean? Maybe you should ask the people before you use a statement like that.
Once again, it shows a either a forgetfulness of the structure of our democracy, because Jim Jordan doesn't represent the American people, he represents his state. And he only represents a part of his state. And he can say that my constituents wouldn't want that, but he can't say Americans don't. This reminds me of a meeting I attended. I was on I served on a board, and I won't name the board, but I was on a board meeting one day, and this was 4 or 5 years ago, and another member of the board we were questioning something about a process. It happened to be at another college. It was a department of another college, and we were discussing a student project or something. And anyway, this particular individual spoke up and said, I think we should use Republican values of truth and decency to help us to determine whether we should do this or not. And he was very passionate about that phrase. And I challenged him immediately and said, I'm sorry, when did truth and decency become the patented value of the Republican Party? I said, I'm not even sure it is the patented value of a religion, let alone a political party. But I have no problem. I would not have challenged you if you had said the American values of truth and decency. Even though I don't believe it is solely relegated to a country either. But I definitely will not sit here and allow a left-handed slap to the Democratic Party by inferring that they don't have these values. Because that's how you get on the slippery slope of demonizing your opponent or the person you disagree with. It's no wonder we're having problems with race and gender equity issues in this country, or we're having problems with Hamas and Israel and the Palestinian people and the Gaza Strip, if we can't even talk civilly without recognizing that we have hidden trigger terms in our language, in our politics.
The efforts in many ways to control outcomes kind of goes with some of the efforts to create an autocracy that we dealt with 3-4 years ago and continue to be concerned about in the unwillingness to listen to other people or share other people's thoughts. And so when somebody says the will of the people, it, to me, without having any valid support from that standpoint, really indicates it's an I statement, not a we statement. It's not him representing the people, it's him representing his opinion and using a we statement that really doesn't exist. And we've seen that in the past.
Yes, and I would phrase it a little differently. I would say it's definitely a tactic,
right,
that is being used to support my opinion,
right,
by assuming that I have support. But I want to take it a little further. I agree that he had no data to suggest that the majority, for anyone to be able to say that America's opinion is this, they must have some poll data or election data that supports that the majority of Americans are in alignment with whatever is being promoted. But I take it a step further, and my step further are the hidden inferences in there. The people he didn't meet. The inference was that if you weren't a part of this of the majority, even if it were true, then you weren't American. There's this hidden pressure now that you can't be in the minority. And by the way, the entire Republican Party is in the minority.
Well, that's true, because if you recognize it, there's probably only about 38% of the populace that is in this conversation that we're currently having.
As Republicans, yes.
Correct.
Right. And then there are independents who sometimes side with the minority and sometimes side with the majority, but they are the swing votes that make it, that create the ultimate majority.
Yep. And
Right.
that independent population is growing.
Yes, because of statements like that.
Correct.
Because of actions like that, and what really bothers me, or I find ironic, is that the Gang of Eight who refused to move, Scalise essentially didn't bother to go through a second vote because he realized the Gang of Eight was never going to convince them. And because the Democratic Party is staying to the side and trying to give the Republicans a chance to all of a sudden, the Democratic Party is even villainized by voting their views. Even the former speaker blamed the Democratic Party for voting him out.
Well, you know what? The Republican Party can solve this pretty quickly. All you need is 20 people from the Republican Party to vote on the Democratic side.
When did the former speaker ever vote for Pelosi?
By the way, the former speaker set this up because he bent over
yes
to the Gang of Eight that allowed this to occur.
Can you not? No, I'm not so sure it was allowed. I think this was a strategic maneuver. They forced the former speaker. First of all, he didn't have the balls to live up to his own agreement.
Yep.
All right. That was a bipartisan agreement, which he negotiated. And then he ended up yielding. And in order to try to keep the Gang of Eight in his tent, he yielded and broke the truce. And even though the Senate and the majority of his own caucus was willing to support this agreement, meaning they had already voted on it and agreed with it, he allowed this Gang of Eight for him to void the agreement. And then they turned on him for that. Why should we trust him? Why should the Democratic Party trust him to be an honest agent after that?
Let's go back to January, when it took him 20 votes.
15.
Whatever. 15 votes. Isn't there a message there that the Republicans should have figured out that this is not the direction, and the only way to get elected was basically to mortgage himself, basically to sell his soul to the devils of eight?
Well, that they have the same problem now.
Right.
Have you noticed that no one has discussed changing that rule? I don't understand why anybody, and I think that's because they believe that if Jim Jordan wins, he'll have the protection of Trump, and nobody would dare, that no single person would dare call for his resignation, because they know that they would be going against the MAGA sect of the Republican Party. So all of this was contrived.
Yep.
And the greatest example, or the greatest evidence of that, is who we're looking at to be the Speaker of the House. A co-conspirator, a co-insurrectionist, a person who has been labeled by his own party members, his previous speakers, as nothing but a disruptor. He hasn't passed one bill for the American people, and yet he chooses to speak for them.
And his wrestling team at Ohio State University was more than willing to express their disdain for him in that role. So he has lived somehow immune to everything that goes on around him. He's got some level of Teflon coat for somebody who does absolutely nothing for anybody but himself.
Well, now that we've expressed our feelings about him, let's go back to the issue because
Yeah,
I
let's do
frankly
that because I think we got off on a tangent. The bigger issue is, how do we get our house in order?
yes.
How do we create long-term change? Because this is embarrassing, it's disgusting, it's frustrating. There's so many greater issues in the world that we really need to be focusing on, whether it's Ukraine or Israel, or even some of the inflationary states in South America that could ultimately impact our economy. We're not focusing on solving our own problems internally. We're ignoring everything for a bunch of people who can't make a decision for the greater good. How do we create long-term solutions so this doesn't become an annual celebration?
So first, let me bring the temperature down just a little because if we're going to solve this, that's how we have to start. And that doesn't mean that everything you just said was not true. It's just that when we look at a problem with that type of heat, we're never going to address the underlying situations, the underlying issues. And for me, the underlying issues is that we have yielded our individual rights to the extremes of the party, of a given party. Or maybe we have yielded our moderate rights or our moderation, our tendency toward moderation to the extreme wings of both parties. And it is time for the truly silent majority, not the violent minorities, to wrest back their power. I actually am heartened by the new faces I am seeing being interviewed from the Republican Party who are saying this is enough. But you can't do it by just fighting in private. Trump doesn't do anything in private. Well, I take that back. He does. He strategizes in private, but his strategy is always about public manipulation. And as we said in a previous conversation, when statesmen start walking away from politics because they may be pilloried for a single opinion that is different from from an extreme wing, that is not democracy. What I'm seeing is moderates being fed up, and they are now being pilloried for doing the same actions that the Gang of Eight did to get us here. And that, as a matter of fact, do you understand what Jim Jordan and the MAGA group was trying to do? When they finally pressured Scalise to step down, which meant that Jim Jordan would be the one left as the obvious nominee, then they started pressuring their Jim's opponents and non-supporters by first saying, we will primary you if you don't support Jim Jordan. We will get, what's his name, from Fox News. We will stick Hannity on you, and we will create bad press for you. And they whittled, and at first, there were almost 60 people that would not vote for Jordan. But in these private conversations, when the carrot didn't work, they used those two sticks.
They're holding people hostage.
Yes, and then they got it down to 20. Now, I'm actually quite proud of those 20 that said, I don't care what you say. I don't care what you promise. You've had 10 years in Congress. Why should you change your clothing now? Why would you change your tactics now? As a matter of fact, what makes you any different from the former speaker? You can promise me one thing and then change your mind once you get to become the speaker. And then he was hoping that if the first vote didn't secure it, anybody who went on record and voted against him, he could then use that. He could use Hannity to attack them between the votes. Now, many of them got around it by not voting no, but voting for somebody else.
So I have an interesting question. By the way, Jordan's going to try to go for a third time around. if the shoe was on the other foot, if this was the Democrats were trying to choose their person, what would that look like?
Well, we saw that now, and what we saw was one of the differences between the two. The Republican Party actually uses the Democratic Party is willing to compromise at some point before the Republican Party will, and they use that as evidence of weakness as opposed to a principle of democracy. But the last term for Pelosi, she had a similar small majority when they were in the majority, and the differences between the progressive wing and the moderate wing of the Democratic Party were just as strident as the differences between the MAGA wing and the moderate wing of the Republican Party. The difference was behavior, though.
Yeah, well, a willingness to sit down and work it out before it became a public discussion. This is
exactly. They still had private discussions, and they still had private differences, and they were just as strident. But they did agree going in that they were not going to disrupt the function of Congress.
Yeah, I mean, the Republicans are just airing their dirty laundry. So I've got
no, they're not just airing their dirty laundry. There is a small group of Republicans that's trying to impose their will.
Right.
And they believe that the work of Congress is worth the sacrifice to get their will done, because it's the only way they're going to get it done. They're not going to get the votes for their extreme agenda. And the only way they can get that is to impose it. That is why you become an authoritarian, an autocrat.
So I want you to play what if again. What if there wasn't a puppet master sitting over the top of the Republican Party, pulling the strings of all of these eunuchs?
Then they might have a chance if they could remember the principles of this country and why they love this country. Right now, all they can focus on is why they don't like the country. When they say, since I can't change things, we're just going to burn it down. Now, they don't really mean burning down the things they like.
No.
They think that they're like forest rangers, that they can perform controlled fires that will only address the issues they want to address. But then they end up changing the rules of how you start a fire, and before you know it, it's not a controlled fire anymore. But now all they're focused on is eliminating the obstacles, and not understanding that there's diesel fuel at the boundaries of all of these obstacles. And that the danger is they will burn down everything.
Isn't the solution just to rake the forest?
Well, that would create jobs.
Yes, well, but right now unemployment is
and it sounds like the slave mentality again, where by God, we can teach a new skill.
This was a good conversation. I think I got a little bit hot and bothered. I think I burned down the house.
No, I understand. I think your temperament reflects my inner temperament as well. I think your frustration is a reflection of America's frustration. I even think that there are many people that may even support Jordan are frustrated by the situation that we are in. But I want to get back to the constant insults we have to endure in the political language that has developed. And I definitely want to remind us that we are not enemies. We have different beliefs or different solutions. And many of those solutions are based on our life's perspectives. We have a guest coming on into in our next conversation that we're very interested in her perspective, in her life's experiences, to help us understand her differences of opinions with some of ours. But that doesn't make her an enemy. It is more than insulting to me to have a member of the House of Representatives who wants to be the Speaker of the entire House to infer that if I am not a Republican, I am not American.
If you watch the news and read the newspaper, you get a world. But if you go to this store and you run into people and you talk to people, you get a whole different world. And I think that the American people don't look across the aisle in the store and think Republican or Democrat. They think American or whatever. But I think the news, because it's so newsworthy, start to they are the kerosene, they are the gas in many ways that inflames a lot of what's going on because it sells news. But I don't think
I totally disagree. I am so sorry. I'm not going to blame the press here, because all the press is doing is putting a camera in front of our politicians. There are times to blame the press. Don't get me wrong. The recent, as a matter of fact, that's an issue that we should probably discuss in another conversation, and that is the bombing of the hospital in the Gaza Strip. And the initial articles that came out clearly blamed Israel for the rocket, which now our intelligence suggests it wasn't an Israeli rocket. And there are people that are former government former government officials who are now in the press who are angry about how that inflamed the Arab world. Well, the Arab world, Hamas also sent out misinformation that concurred with that. But I'm not saying the press doesn't make mistakes, but the press can't change how the politicians actually respond. When McCarthy, was speaking, I used to just frown when he would be asked a question, and he would deflect the question to democratic behavior or a democratic issue rather than answer the question. I understand what you're saying. It is that venue that serves as an inflammatory process, as an inflammatory vehicle, but it is not the press itself that's causing this problem. I believe when American people go to the polls to vote, and they vote Democrat or Republican, they're voting for people who are in alignment with their personal views. But they expect whoever wins to coalesce and get the job done. They don't expect them to continue the war in Congress. I don't believe that's what we expect. And yet, that's exactly the excuse they make.
So my comment stems from the fact that the major news networks represent either side of the political spectrum. And so there tends to be a reporting that is biased. And since a large majority of our populace receives news also from social media now, there is less reporting of global news and much greater reporting of biased news. And that's why I believe that even though we try to present information. Once you start on a slippery path to the right or to the left, it's much harder to climb back out of it from a newsworthy standpoint. That's where my premise was coming from.
I stand corrected. I agree with you there. I was thinking of news. I was not addressing opinion stations or opinions programs.
Right.
And the biggest problem, again, the biggest problem may not be I still stand by the fact that I don't think it is that the free press is the issue. The issue is our sophistication in differentiating free press from opinion and propaganda promotion, right? And I understand that we have programs that seem to have to be a wolf in sheep clothing, or to have blended purposes, and that is a problem that we as a society, everybody thinks you can address these things through regulation. I'm not one of them. I believe in an educated community that can tell the difference.
Well, I want to put on the topic list for the future the free press, because
Okay.
Nothing is free.
Okay.
And would beg to differ that much of the free press has been bought in some way, shape, or form. And we don't want to dive into that today because it'd take another hour.
That's true, but yes, I'd love to talk about the principle of free press.
The principle of free press is one thing, but the reality of free press is another.
Well, that doesn't mean that there isn't one. And by the way, nothing is free, but the moniker of free in the term free press does not relate to cost.
I know, but
so once again, even you have now adulterated the phrase free press.
No, because the word free has many definitions.
Let me pull that back, because you're right. Even a free democracy, even a free country has a cost.
And right? I think we're seeing that right now.
I mean, yeah, no, but see, I'm going back now. We're seeing something different. What I'm trying to get you to, our veterans will tell you that our freedom came at a cost. And so when we use the word free to describe anything, it is that cost that provides it. And when we don't respect that cost, there's a different cost.
Correct.
Right? That's
correct.
That which is what you're talking about.
Absolutely. And I think yes. a good way to tie up loose ends is to basically say freedom isn't free.
Yes. We're saying the same thing.
Absolutely. And I think that's a good place to, not peanut butter and jelly time, because we're not recording on the same day that we have peanut butter and jelly, but
it's peanut butter and jelly time for me because I'm a bachelor.
Oh, well, where's Doris?
She's in Jackson visiting our moms, and okay. I get to join her next week.
Well, then you enjoy your peanut butter and jelly. I'm going to go have a glass of something to drink, but non-alcoholic, because I've still got one more phone call. But yeah, what was it? A house divided cannot stand?
Yes, a house divided within itself cannot stand.
Yes. Since I'm listening to one of Lincoln's biographies, that has come up a number of different times. And I've got lots of questions at some point in time for another conversation about that, but not today.
Yeah, well, I'm glad we got a chance to see the passionate, enraged Peter Weinstein. I mean,
oh yeah, well, you saw how far off the center I actually go. It's like the needle moved a little bit.
Yeah, it's okay. It was fine, and frankly, once again, I want to say I think you reflected the common feeling, although I don't have any polls to support this, of the majority of Americans.
You won't hear me say this very often, but I'd like to quote a famous Republican.
I'm listening.
Abraham Lincoln.
Oh yeah. Well,
and everybody goes back to the fact
everybody wants to quote him.
A house divided against itself cannot stand, and that's what we're dealing with right now. Thank you, Phil. Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, Nationwide. Thank you to all our listeners. Send us your opinions. You can go to www.peterandphil.com to catch on our prior recordings, and I believe there's a place you can express your thoughts as well. And we'll see if we can fix the house between now and the next time we speak. You bring the hammers, I'll bring the nails, and let's get Jimmy Carter, because he was really good about building houses after he got out of office.
Yeah, he actually was pretty good at doing it while he was in office, but he had a recalcitrant Congress as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Phil.
Thank you, Peter. Enjoyed it.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.